Researchers studying overconfidence have found something genuinely strange. In study after study, the people who rate themselves as most competent at a task are often not the most skilled performers. They're frequently the ones with the least actual ability, while the people who are genuinely the most skilled tend to underestimate themselves. In other words, a huge amount of what looks like confidence in the world around you isn't competence at all. It's a measurable psychological blind spot, and by the end of this video, you're going to be able to spot it in others, and more importantly, in yourself. And you're going to walk away with real tools for building the kind of confidence that doesn't collapse the moment things get hard. Welcome to the channel, or if you're new here, I'm glad you found this video. I'm a psychologist, and today we're going to spend real time pulling apart the difference between earned confidence and what I call fake confidence, the performance of certainty that so many people, maybe even people you admire, are putting on without actually feeling it underneath. We'll go through the research in depth, a real story from my practice, and then several practical tools for telling the difference in yourself and building the genuine version instead. If understanding what's actually happening behind people's behaviour interests you, this is exactly the kind of thing we cover every week here. So go ahead and hit subscribe before you keep watching, because today's a long one and there's a lot to get through. Let's start with that finding I mentioned. It comes from a well-known body of research often referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect, named after the psychologist who first documented it in the late 1990s. The pattern shows up again and again across very different skills and domains, from grammar to logical reasoning to humour. People early in learning something, with relatively little actual ability, tend to dramatically overestimate their competence because they don't yet know enough to recognise what they don't know. This is sometimes called the double burden of incompetence. You lack the skill, and you also lack the skill needed to accurately judge that you lack the skill. Meanwhile, people who've developed real expertise become increasingly aware of the complexity and nuance involved in their domain, which paradoxically makes them more cautious and less boastful about their own ability, a pattern researchers sometimes call the imposter of competence, where the most capable people are often privately the least convinced of their own mastery. So when you encounter someone who seems unshakably, loudly confident about something complicated, statistically speaking, that confidence is at least as likely to reflect a gap in their self-awareness as it is to reflect genuine mastery. But there's a second, quieter version of fake confidence that's even more common, and it doesn't come from ignorance at all, it comes from anxiety. Psychologists sometimes describe this as compensatory confidence, a performance of certainty specifically constructed to manage an underlying fear of being seen as inadequate. This is the executive who speaks loudly and decisively in every meeting, not necessarily because they're certain, but because hesitation feels, to their nervous system, like exposure, like revealing a vulnerability they can't afford anyone to see. Underneath that performance is often a deeply uncomfortable internal state, sometimes called the imposter experience, a persistent sense that you're fundamentally unqualified and that at any moment everyone around you might discover it. Research on this suggests it's remarkably widespread, showing up across high achievers in nearly every field, including notably very senior, very accomplished people, who from the outside would seem to have every reason to feel secure. Surveys of physicians, lawyers, academics and executives have repeatedly found that a majority report experiencing this feeling at some point in their careers, often privately, often while presenting an entirely different face to their colleagues. Here's what's happening physiologically when someone performs fake confidence under pressure. Their body is often running a genuine threat response, an elevated heart rate, a tight chest, a flood of cortisol, the exact same physiology you'd expect from real fear. But the behaviour layered on top is loud, assertive, even commanding. This mismatch between internal state and external performance takes real effort to maintain, which is part of why people who rely heavily on fake confidence often describe feeling utterly drained afterward, as if they'd been performing a role rather than simply existing in the room. Some researchers refer to this gap between felt experience and displayed behaviour as emotional labour, a concept originally studied in service jobs, where workers had to perform pleasantness regardless of how they actually felt. And it turns out the exact same depleting mechanism applies when you're performing confidence you don't actually feel. There's also an interesting social dimension to all of this worth pausing on. Multiple studies on group dynamics have found that people consistently mistake the loudest, most assertive voice in a room for the most competent one, even when objective measures of ability show no such correlation and sometimes show the opposite. This means that fake confidence isn't just personally exhausting, it's also socially rewarded, which creates a strange incentive structure, where the behaviour that feels worse to sustain internally is often the behaviour that gets reinforced externally through promotions, attention, and social status. Understanding this dynamic doesn't excuse it, but it does explain why so many people keep performing confidence they don't feel. The world keeps telling them it's working. If any of this is landing for you, drop a comment telling me whether you've noticed this gap more in yourself or in someone you know. I read through these regularly. And if this is reframing something for you already, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. I want to tell you about a patient I worked with. I'll call him Tobias. He was 34 years old, a sales director, who came to me because, in his words, everyone thinks I have it together, and I don't know how to tell them otherwise. Tobias had built an entire professional identity around being the most decisive, most assured person in any room. But privately, he described feeling like a fraud, almost constantly, certain that one wrong call would expose him. He told me that before big presentations, he would sometimes feel his heart racing in the parking lot. And yet within minutes of walking into the room, he could flip into a version of himself that seemed entirely unshakable, a version his colleagues had come to rely on. What we discovered together was that Tobias had learned very early, in a household where uncertainty was treated as weakness, that any hesitation he showed was met with disappointment. So by adolescence, he'd already built a reflexive habit of projecting certainty, regardless of what he actually felt inside. This had worked for him professionally in many ways, but it had also left him chronically exhausted and increasingly disconnected from his own genuine reactions, because he'd spent so many years overriding them. Over the course of our work together, Tobias started to notice something important. The moments when his fake confidence cracked weren't actually disasters. They were just moments, brief, survivable, and almost always far less catastrophic than his anticipatory anxiety had predicted. Once Tobias understood that his loud confidence and his private anxiety weren't contradictions, they were actually two sides of the exact same coping strategy, something shifted. He stopped trying to permanently silence the self-doubt and instead learned to let it exist quietly in the background while he made decisions anyway, which, counterintuitively, made him both calmer and, by his own account, more genuinely persuasive, because he was no longer spending so much of his internal energy on the performance itself. So here's what actually builds real confidence, as opposed to the performance of it. The first tool is what's sometimes called competence-based confidence, meaning confidence that's deliberately built through small, specific, repeated successes rather than through self-talk or affirmations alone. Confidence that's earned through actual evidence. I've handled this exact type of situation before, and it went fine, tends to be far more durable under pressure than confidence that's simply asserted without that underlying evidence base. This is why simply telling yourself you're confident rarely works on its own. Your nervous system isn't convinced by words alone. It's convinced by accumulated lived proof. The second tool is learning to tolerate visible uncertainty in low-stakes situations on purpose. This sounds small, but it's powerful. Deliberately saying, "I'm not sure, let me think about that," in a meeting or conversation where the stakes are genuinely low, and then noticing that the world doesn't end, that people don't actually respect you less. Over time, this directly weakens the belief that any visible hesitation is dangerous. You're essentially running small, safe experiments that disconfirm the catastrophic prediction your anxious brain has been making for years. The third tool is separating your sense of worth from your performance in any single moment. Real confidence isn't the belief that you'll always get things right. It's the belief that you'll be okay, even when you don't. That distinction matters enormously because fake confidence tends to be brittle, entirely dependent on maintaining a perfect track record, while genuine confidence can actually absorb mistakes without collapsing. People with this kind of grounded confidence don't necessarily feel less fear in high-stakes moments. They've simply built a stronger relationship with the part of themselves that exists independently of any single outcome. A fourth tool, and this one often gets overlooked, is selective honesty with a small, trusted circle. You don't need to broadcast every internal doubt to everyone you know. That's neither necessary nor advisable, but having even 1 or 2 relationships where you can say, out loud, honestly, I actually felt pretty unsure about that, tends to significantly reduce the overall burden of maintaining a performance everywhere else in your life. The goal isn't total transparency with the world, it's making sure the performance isn't your only mode, that somewhere you get to simply be accurate about your internal state without managing anyone's perception of you. Now, an important caution here. Working through ordinary self-doubts and the imposter experience is genuinely something most people can do with these kinds of tools, and for many people, that gradual, deliberate practice is enough. But if what you're feeling underneath the surface includes persistent, severe anxiety, a pervasive sense of worthlessness that doesn't lift, or distress significant enough to interfere with your work, your relationships, or your daily functioning, that's worth bringing directly to a licensed mental health professional, because there may be more going on that benefits from structured clinical support, sometimes including therapy approaches specifically designed for anxiety and self-worth, and reaching out for that kind of support is a sign of genuine strength, not weakness. So let's bring this together. A lot of what looks like confidence in the world is either the unaware overestimation described by the Dunning-Kruger effect, or compensatory confidence built specifically to manage underlying anxiety, and both of these are different from real, earned confidence, which tends to be quieter, more durable, and surprisingly comfortable with visible uncertainty. The exhausting part isn't having doubt. Everyone has doubt. The exhausting part is the performance built around hiding it. By deliberately building competence through small, real evidence, practicing tolerance for visible hesitation in low-stakes moments, separating your sense of worth from any single performance, and allowing at least a little honesty with people you trust, you can start replacing the draining performance of fake confidence with something steadier, quieter, and far less costly to maintain. If this video changed how you think about confidence, I have a follow-up video right after this one on exactly how chronic stress reshapes the brain over time, and I think you'll find it just as worth your time. So go ahead and click through to that next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, take a moment to send it their way. One last note. This video is intended for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for personalised care from a licensed mental health provider. So if you're struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out to one. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.